A black woman was erased from the guest list, but her billionaire possessive husband made them regret it. Warm welcome to Beyond Color Stories. I'm your storyteller, James, and I truly hope you're doing well today. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what's the weather like in your hometown right now? Now listen, my dear family and new listeners, please don't skip this story. I'm telling you with all my heart, this is one of the most loving and romantic stories you've ever heard. A story so beautiful, so touching. You'll feel every moment deep in your soul. You've never listened to a story like this before, I promise. So before we begin, I gently ask you, please join James's family by hitting that subscribe button right now. Let's grow this beautiful community of love, hope, and unforgettable stories. Now, without any more delay, let's dive into today's story, Love. The night of the Starlight Foundation Charity Gala was one that shimmered with excess. Chandeliers dripped with crystal, tables were dressed in silk, and laughter from the elite echoed beneath the golden arches of the ballroom ceiling. But none of it mattered to Jasmine as she entered the hall, her soft brown skin glowing under the soft lights, her eyes framed by delicate lashes that fluttered not from nerves, but quiet elegance. Wearing a navy blue gown that hugged her in all the right places without shouting for attention, she walked with the kind of grace that wasn't taught but inherited from women who had weathered storms and still managed to smile. Most of the room didn't notice her at first. They were too busy scanning for familiar last names, inherited fortunes, and influential surnames. But one man did notice her, and not just in the way men look at beauty, but in the way a starving man stares at salvation. Mr. Carter, billionaire CEO of the Carter Global Empire, stood beside a marble pillar with a flute of champagne untouched in his hand, his tailored tuxedo fitting him like second skin. But his usually commanding gaze softened the moment she entered the room. He had attended dozens of events like this, surrounded by power-hungry investors, hollow smiles, and empty toasts. But the moment he saw Jasmine, it felt like the room faded into grayscale while she remained in vivid color. It wasn't just the way she looked, though that alone could have made kings kneel, but it was something quieter, something deeper, the kind of glow that came from within and wrapped itself around her like a shield. Carter found himself walking toward her without thinking, a rare thing for a man who calculated everything. Jasmine had noticed him too, of course. His face was familiar from countless magazine covers, news articles, and television interviews. The enigmatic billionaire whose charisma was as dangerous as his net worth. She had expected him to be surrounded by models, politicians, or industry tycoons. Instead, she turned and found him standing in front of her, his voice low and respectful as he introduced himself. Not as a CEO, but as a man who simply wanted to know her name. And when she told him, Jasmine, he smiled like he had just heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Their first conversation was brief but electric. They spoke about the cause the charity supported, but before long they were talking about favorite childhood memories, guilty pleasure books, and the kind of music that made them cry. Carter was stunned. Jasmine wasn't just stunning. She was wise, witty, curious, and deeply passionate about things that didn't come with dollar signs. For a man used to being admired for his money, being seen through his soul was rare. And for Jasmine, who had met her fair share of men intimidated by her confidence or dismissive of her roots, Carter's attentiveness felt like a warm hand over her heart. He didn't interrupt. He didn't patronize. He simply listened and looked at her like she mattered. When the night ended, Carter didn't ask to take her home. Instead, he asked for a second meeting, somewhere away from the noise and flashing cameras. Jasmine agreed, her curiosity awakened not by his fame, but by his vulnerability. She had seen something in his eyes, an exhaustion, a hunger for something real, something honest. And she knew then he wasn't just another rich man with an ego. He was a soul aching for truth. Their next meeting took place not in a five-star restaurant or lavish rooftop bar, but in a quiet little bookstore tucked between two narrow alleys in the older part of the city. Carter arrived wearing a cap and casual jacket, his face partially hidden, but his energy unmistakable. Jasmine was already there, sitting with a coffee in hand, reading a novel she had already read twice before, but loved enough to read again. He joined her without a word, and they spent the next 3 hours wrapped in a world of paperbacks, poetry, laughter, and occasional stolen glances that said more than words ever could. It wasn't long before their meetings became regular: private picnics in abandoned gardens, walks in the rain with no umbrellas, late-night calls that turned into early-morning silences filled with affection. They fell for each other quietly, but completely. Jasmine brought calm into Carter's chaotic life. Her presence was like a lullaby that softened the sharp edges of his world. And Carter brought passion into Jasmine's days. He looked at her like she was the answer to every question he had never dared to ask. But as their bond deepened, so did the pressure from the outside world. Carter's family was a dynasty rooted in old money and even older ideas. His father was a man obsessed with image and bloodlines. His mother a society queen who judged women by their skin tone, social background, and their family name. Jasmine, with her brown skin and modest upbringing, didn't fit into their mold. Carter knew this, which is why their love remained hidden. Not because he was ashamed, but because he was afraid of what they might try to do to her. Jasmine sensed this too. She wasn't naive. She saw the weight he carried behind his eyes every time someone from his world got too close. Still, she didn't pressure him. She never asked for public declarations or lavish shows of affection. All she wanted was honesty, presence, and truth. And Carter gave her all of that. He showered her with attention in the shadows, took her hand when no one was looking, kissed her forehead in places where they were just two souls, not two worlds colliding. Their love was private, but never hidden in spirit. Each night he left her apartment after spending hours cooking for her, massaging her feet, or reading her poetry he'd written. Jasmine would stand by the door long after he left, her fingers resting where his lips had kissed her hand. She loved him, not for his billions, but for the way he looked at her like she made the universe worth surviving. And Carter, for all his wealth and fame, had never loved like this. He found himself thinking about her between meetings, smiling at the thought of her voice when surrounded by executives, and writing her name in his planner like a teenager in love. He had dozens of women throw themselves at him for power, for attention, for legacy. But Jasmine wanted none of that. She only wanted him, the version that woke up tired, that carried emotional bruises, that still remembered how to be soft. And that terrified him, because no one had ever had the power to break his walls quite like her. But as much as they tried to hold on to their secret bubble, the world outside began to press against it harder and harder. Paparazzi sightings increased. Whispers began among his business partners. His mother called him more often, subtly inquiring about the mystery woman he was seen near. "She doesn't belong in our world, Carter," she warned one day over brunch. "She doesn't understand the expectations." Carter's jaw had clenched so tight he thought it might crack. But he said nothing. Not yet. He didn't want to drag Jasmine into a war, not until he was ready to protect her fully. Jasmine, for her part, remained strong. She never complained, never asked him to defend her, even though the rumors grew crueler each day. Gold digger, some said. Just a phase, others scoffed. But she stayed dignified, even as it hurt, because she knew her heart and she knew his. And every time he whispered, "I love you," into her neck, as they lay in bed with the city lights bleeding through the curtains, she believed it. Fully. Completely. And one rainy evening, as they sat by her window, watching the city drip in silver, Carter turned to her and said, "Jasmine, one day I'll bring you into the light, not because you need it, but because the world needs to see what I see." Jasmine touched his cheek and smiled, though her eyes filled with tears. "I'm not afraid of the dark," she whispered, "but I'm ready when you are." That promise sat between them like a secret vow, a silent chord strung between two hearts, beating in perfect rhythm. For a time, that was enough. Their love was a quiet rebellion, a garden blooming behind walls of silence. But love like theirs was never meant to stay hidden. It was too honest, too loud in its quietness, too powerful to be erased by tradition or prejudice. And as fate would soon demand, the time for shadows would end, because even love written in whispers cannot be silenced forever. The promise Carter whispered that night of bringing Jasmine into the light still echoed quietly in her ears days later, not because she doubted him, but because she knew how much it would cost. Outside, the city moved as always, ruthless, fast, glittering with temptation and cruelty in equal measure. But inside Jasmine's apartment, their love remained a quiet rebellion. She didn't know that while Carter kissed her forehead and told her he loved her under warm lamplight, his family had already begun to investigate the woman who had captured his heart. The news didn't come as a shock when it finally reached them, though. For weeks, his mother had been gathering whispers, his father scanning society pages, even his younger sister lurking on social media like a hawk dressed in pearls. But when they confirmed that Carter was not just seeing Jasmine, but had been loving her in private for months, they reacted not with concern, but with condescension disguised as care. They didn't see the poetry in her soul, the calm grace she carried, or the way she softened their son's entire existence. No, they saw skin tone, family name, bank balance, and everything else they believed defined a woman's worth. It began with subtle jabs. At the next board brunch, Carter's mother mentioned a charity luncheon and accidentally failed to include Jasmine's name on the invitation. At first, Carter thought it might truly have been an oversight. Jasmine brushed it off with a smile. "It's fine," she said gently. "You know I prefer quiet afternoons anyway." But he knew her heart had dipped a little in that moment. He saw the flicker in her eyes, the disappointment that came not from being excluded, but from being reduced. Then came the phone calls, long, winding conversations with his father, filled with veiled warnings, masked behind fatherly advice. "Carter, you're young. You've built something extraordinary. The world is watching. You can't let one impulsive romance undo your empire." Carter's fingers tightened around his phone every time the voice on the other end dared refer to Jasmine as an impulse, as a mistake. He never screamed, he never swore, but his silences grew heavier, more thunderous, and Jasmine noticed. He would arrive at her door with tired eyes, his smile slower to bloom, his arms holding her tighter like she was his anchor in a storm he couldn't name yet. And still, Jasmine said nothing. She never asked for explanations or updates on the war she suspected was brewing behind closed doors in luxury mansions and high-rise boardrooms. Instead, she welcomed him with quiet affection. She brewed tea, played his favorite jazz records, and curled into his side as though she had no fear of losing him. But inside, Jasmine knew the game being played. She had seen it before. The polite racism of polished families who called themselves modern but treated skin like scandal. The strategic silencing of women like her, not loud enough to call hatred, but sharp enough to cut. Still, she refused to lose herself in anger. She had learned early that dignity was sometimes the only armor left when the world insisted on breaking you down. And Carter, though boiling with rage beneath his careful calm, admired her more deeply than ever. She didn't demand a war, yet her grace dared him to fight one. And that terrified his family more than her beauty, more than her skin, because they saw that his love wasn't just infatuation, it was foundation. Jasmine was not a distraction. She was destiny. One evening, Carter sat in the penthouse lounge of his family estate, his mother seated across from him in her usual posture of poised power, manicured fingers curled around a crystal wine glass. "She's not what I imagined for you," she said with the kind of smile that chilled bones. "You deserve someone who complements our legacy." Carter stared at her for a moment, then leaned forward, his voice calm but dangerous. "She is my legacy," he said slowly. "She's everything I want this family to remember me for." His mother blinked, stunned at his certainty, but his father jumped in with a chuckle, trying to redirect. "Son, no one's asking you to abandon your friend. We're simply saying there's a time and place for everyone. Some things don't belong in the spotlight." That was when Carter stood up, his jaw clenched, his spine straight. "She belongs everywhere I do. And if this family can't understand that, then maybe it's the legacy that needs changing, not the woman I love." With that, he walked away, leaving his parents speechless, their wine untouched, and their perfectly manicured illusions beginning to fracture. Jasmine didn't hear the details when he arrived at her apartment that night. He didn't want to burden her with the ugliness. He simply pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than usual, his face buried in her neck, his breath uneven. She wrapped her arms around him without asking. She didn't need to. Her silence was strength, and he drew courage from it like a thirsty man at a spring. Days passed, but the tension didn't ease. If anything, it grew tighter, sharper. His family began sending less subtle messages now. Carter received a wedding invitation for a cousin's ceremony in which his name appeared, but Jasmine's did not. His mother arranged a press dinner and informed him last minute, stating there were limited seats. And yet half the room was filled with barely known socialites in designer gowns. Still, Jasmine said nothing. She wore her silence like silk, elegant, calm, indestructible. She wasn't blind to what they were doing, but she refused to be broken. One night, while Carter held her hand and apologized for the 100th time, she whispered softly, "Don't you dare be sorry for loving me. That's their shame to carry, not yours." Then came the announcement of the party, the crown jewel of his family's annual traditions, a luxury affair known across the city. It was where engagements were hinted, alliances whispered, and power flaunted beneath chandeliers older than most empires. It was also the first public event where Carter had planned to bring Jasmine. Officially, as his guest, as the woman he loved. Jasmine was hesitant, not because she was afraid, but because she knew what it would mean. "You're ready for this?" she asked one night as they lay in bed. Carter turned to her, his eyes unwavering. "I've never been more ready. This ends now." But the family had already made their move. Days before the event, when Carter requested the final guest list, Jasmine's name had mysteriously vanished, replaced, erased, as if she had never existed. No phone call, no explanation, just an empty line where her presence should have been. The moment Carter saw the list, something inside him snapped. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He simply stood still for a long, long time, holding the paper in his hand as if it were a death certificate for the man he used to be. That night, he didn't tell Jasmine. Not immediately. He needed time, to think, to plan. His silence was not doubt. It was the stillness of a storm before it rips the sky open. He returned to the estate the next morning, unannounced, walking into the family's ornate dining room mid-brunch. "You erased her," he said, voice like steel. His mother looked up, calmly buttering her croissant. "Darling, don't be dramatic. These events are delicate. We simply thought—" "You thought nothing," he cut in, his tone sending a chill across the marble floor. "You tried to erase the woman I love. You disrespected her." And me. His father cleared his throat, trying to play diplomat again. Carter, we're protecting our image. No, you're protecting your prejudice. Silence fell across the table. Carter didn't wait for their excuses. She will be there, with me, in front of all your friends, your guests, your investors. And when she walks in with me, you'll all know she belongs more than anyone else in that room. You just wait and watch. He left the estate with fire in his veins. But when he arrived at Jasmine's place that evening, he walked in with love in his eyes. He told her everything, every word they said, every insult unspoken but implied. She listened in silence, her face unreadable. But when he was done, Jasmine walked to the window, looking out at the city she had grown up in, fought through, survived in. Then she turned to him and said, "Then let them see me." And in that moment Carter fell in love with her all over again, not for her strength, but for her decision to never let the world steal her softness. They began preparing, not just for a party, but for a reckoning. Jasmine chose her gown carefully, not to impress, but to exist unapologetically. Carter chose his tux, matching hers with a subtle flair that whispered unity, and together they stood not as man and woman, but as a promise, a force. The calm before the storm was over. The war had begun. But this was no longer a battle of appearances. It was a battle for love's rightful place in the light. The night before the party was silent, but not in the way silence usually carries dread. No, it was the kind of quiet before something sacred, like a universe catching its breath just before a cosmic shift. Jasmine sat on the edge of her velvet chair by the window, brushing gentle curls from her forehead, her silhouette kissed by the amber lights of the city glowing outside. Behind her, Carter stood, watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with her beauty and everything to do with how she carried herself in a world that dared to look down on her. There were thousands of women in his orbit, women who walked red carpets and hosted gala dinners, but none of them moved him like Jasmine. None of them took a seat inside his soul and rebuilt his understanding of love from the inside out. In business meetings, he was calm, calculated, strategic, his empire built on mergers and quiet takeovers. But with her, there was no strategy. There was only instinct. And that instinct had turned into obsession. Not the unhealthy kind, but the kind born from a man who had found the one thing that made everything else meaningless. Jasmine didn't know that he spent late nights pacing in his office, canceling meetings just to make sure she felt safe, sending private security even when she said it wasn't necessary. He couldn't help it. He had tasted a love so pure that the thought of anyone tainting it ignited something primal inside him. Earlier that week, he had caught wind of a snide remark one of his board members had made about Jasmine's skin, suggesting that Carter's image would suffer. The man didn't last a full day on the board after that. Carter didn't confront him with anger. He fired him with a calm so cold it made everyone else in the room rethink their own biases. That was the thing about Carter. The world saw him as a polished CEO with tailored suits, a jawline that made fashion brands beg, and a presence that made rooms pause. But behind closed doors, he was a man who burned only for Jasmine. And his love for her wasn't poetic. It was territorial, fierce, unapologetically protective. He touched her like she was art that deserved to be preserved in gold. He kissed her shoulder in the morning and whispered that her skin reminded him of the earth, solid, sacred, and stunning. When she frowned, he stroked her cheek and told her even her sadness was beautiful. He memorized the scent of her hair like it was his favorite fragrance and insisted she wear nothing else. There were moments when Jasmine would laugh softly, brushing off his possessiveness with a shake of her head, but inside it melted her. Because for the first time in her life, someone wasn't just standing by her. They were standing in front of her, beside her, behind her, shielding her like she was made of diamonds and dawn. Still, Jasmine tried to hold on to her grace. She knew the burden of being a black woman in love with a powerful white man came with layers of judgment from every angle, some subtle, some sharp. But Carter didn't care. He didn't want her to shrink or adjust. He wanted her to stand as she was, to take up all the space the world tried to deny her. Every time they entered a room together and she felt eyes measuring her worth, he would squeeze her hand a little tighter, lean down, and whisper, "Let them choke on their jealousy." It wasn't just talk. He changed his entire public narrative. Photos of Jasmine started appearing in business magazines, not as an accessory, but as his equal. At a shareholder gala, he brought her up during his keynote, publicly thanking her for keeping his heart grounded and his vision clear. "This empire means nothing if I can't build a life beside the woman who inspires it," he'd said to a room full of stunned billionaires. Jasmine had smiled politely through it, but later that night, in the privacy of their shared apartment, she wept in his arms. "No one's ever fought for me like that," she whispered, and Carter held her so tightly it was as if he feared the universe might steal her away if he let go for even a second. The more the world whispered behind their backs, the louder Carter became in his love. It wasn't loud in the traditional sense. He didn't shout on rooftops or post dramatic social media essays. No, his love was loud in the way he always included her, always gave her a seat at every table, and always silenced anyone who tried to question her presence. His mother called again, 3 times in one day, urging him to reconsider attending the party with Jasmine. "People talk," she warned. "You must think of your company's image, darling." He smiled bitterly, rubbing the bridge of his nose, and responded coldly, "I am thinking of my image. That's exactly why she'll be with me. She is my image. She's my truth." He hung up before she could answer. Jasmine, ever intuitive, sensed the war in his tone that night and curled into him on the couch, letting her love speak in silence. And Carter, always a man in control, buried his face in her neck and breathed her in like a prayer. "I don't care who I have to fight," he murmured. "You're not going anywhere, not ever." And when she looked up at him, her eyes glowing with something fierce and fragile, he knew that his love had become his life's greatest cause. Even in private, Carter couldn't keep his hands off her. Not because of lust, though it was ever present between them, but because touching her reminded him she was real, that she chose him, that despite everything she loved him with a gentleness no billion-dollar deal could ever buy. He'd trace his fingers down her back, slowly, reverently, whispering stories about the stars and galaxies, telling her she made the universe feel smaller. He kissed the marks on her thighs like they were sacred maps leading him home. He'd hold her at night, wrapped around her like a shield, and if she ever stirred in her sleep, his grip would tighten. It wasn't just possessiveness, it was purpose. She was the center of his being now, the core he didn't know he was missing, and that terrified his family. They saw him slipping away from the legacy they had built, not realizing he was finally building one of his own. Jasmine tried to stay neutral, to not stir the flames between him and his parents. But the day Carter found out his mother had privately called Jasmine's past unfit for their lineage during a brunch conversation with family friends, he didn't hesitate. He called her out in front of every one of them. "You talk about bloodlines like royalty, but your heart is filthy with pride," he said coldly. "You don't get to question a woman's worth based on where she came from when she's already proven to have more class than this entire room." Jasmine didn't even need to speak. Carter had become her sword and shield. And he wasn't done. At home, he'd sit at her feet, massaging them after long days, and whisper promises not of diamonds or jets, but of honor, protection, and respect. "You will never walk alone again," he vowed one night as she dozed off in his arms. "I will ruin anyone who tries to take your peace." She believed him, not because of the grand gestures, but because of the way he loved her in the quiet. When she woke up with nightmares from a cruel comment she'd read online, he made her herbal tea and sat beside her until the sun came up. When she hesitated to wear a bold dress to a fashion show, afraid of being judged, he stood behind her, kissed the back of her neck, and said, "If they stare, let them drown in envy." His love didn't need approval. It demanded presence. And Jasmine, despite her calm exterior, began to feel something shift inside her. She wasn't just loved, she was protected, cherished, and celebrated by a man who could have had anyone but chose her every single time. She didn't need to ask for reassurance. He offered it in every touch, every look, every word. He made it clear to the world that Jasmine wasn't just someone he loved. She was someone he would go to war for. The eve of the party arrived, and Carter was pacing their suite, reviewing every detail. Security, transportation, press presence, everything had to be perfect. Not because of optics, but because Jasmine deserved a night where no shadow touched her light. He had arranged for her favorite flowers to be waiting in the car, hired a photographer to capture private, unposed moments between them, and tailored his tuxedo to subtly match the deep golden tone of her gown. "Tonight," he said, gripping her hands, "we walk into that place not for revenge, but for love. But if anyone dares disrespect you again, they'll regret the day they learned my name." Jasmine smiled softly, placing her hand over his heart. "Let them see us," she said. "Let them feel what real love looks like." And Carter, with a fire burning in his eyes and Jasmine's hand tucked safely in his, knew the night would be more than a party. It would be a reckoning, a declaration, and he would make the world remember that no amount of wealth or whiteness could outshine a love born from truth, protected by fire, and carried by a man who refused to let history repeat itself. The air in their penthouse suite felt heavier than usual, though no one spoke about it. The morning sun filtered in through floor-to-ceiling windows, but Jasmine's eyes didn't follow the light. She was seated quietly on the edge of their custom linen chaise, scrolling slowly through her email, the invitation Carter had promised her etched in her mind. The Winter Gala, his family's signature annual event, graced by senators, socialites, royalty from other continents, was approaching in just 3 days. And Jasmine, who had already picked out her gown weeks ago, a champagne gold piece with hand-sewn crystals Carter had said reminded him of her soul, was searching for her name on the official guest confirmation. The list had been sent to Carter's office that morning, and she'd curiously checked it when the assistant left it on the desk. She wasn't snooping. She was hopeful, excited even. She imagined Carter's hand in hers as they walked down the marble steps of the ballroom, flashes from cameras glinting off their joined fingers, his proud smile as they slow danced beneath the 1,000-piece crystal chandelier. She had dreamed of it not for recognition, but for validation, for finally being accepted, not only in his arms but in the world that always seemed to push her away. But as her eyes skimmed line after line, names she knew, names she didn't, hers was not among them. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Maybe it had been misprinted. Maybe they used her maiden name. Maybe it was just missing from this copy. But the more she stared, the more her heart sank, a silent gravity pulling her into that all-too-familiar place of doubt. Her hands trembled slightly, and she swallowed the knot rising in her throat. She didn't want to make it an issue. She didn't want to disturb Carter, who was taking a call in his study. So she folded the paper quietly, placed it back exactly as it was, and walked slowly into the hallway. Her footsteps were soundless, almost like she didn't want to exist at that moment. But Carter knew her too well. When she gently knocked on his study door and peeked in with that delicate expression she wore when something hurt, but she was pretending it didn't, he immediately placed the call on hold. "Baby?" he said, voice dipped in concern. Jasmine stepped in, forcing a smile that barely reached her eyes. Hey, I just noticed something about the party invite, she began softly, each word chosen with painful care. I don't think I'm on the list. Silence stretched in the room like a taut wire. Carter's eyebrows furrowed instantly. He stepped toward her, gently taking her hand. That can't be right. I gave them your name personally. You're my guest, my only guest. Jasmine nodded, but her eyes betrayed her. I checked, love. I looked twice. It's not there. That moment changed everything. Carter's face turned from confusion to a still, icy rage. He didn't say a word as he strode toward the guest list she had returned to the desk. Picking up the papers, his eyes scanned line after line with the speed of a man who had read too many contracts not to miss detail. And sure enough, her name was missing, erased, deliberately. His lips pressed into a line, his jaw so tight a nerve twitched near his temple. Jasmine saw the shift, the calm before the storm breaking. Who sent this? He asked in a voice too quiet, too controlled. I think your mother's assistant dropped it off earlier, Jasmine answered gently. It's okay, Carter. It's just a party. But it wasn't just a party to him. It was a symbol. It was their night. And someone, his family, had tried to erase her again. And this time they had done it publicly, officially, on record. It's not okay, Carter replied, his voice deeper now, laced with venom. It's never going to be okay for them to pretend you don't exist. He marched to his phone and dialed directly to his mother's private line. Jasmine reached for his arm, trying to calm him, but he gently pushed her hand away. Not out of cruelty, but out of sheer boiling fury he could no longer contain. When his mother picked up, her tone was laced in fake warmth. Darling, I was just thinking about calling you. But Carter wasn't interested in pleasantries. You erased her, he said plainly. The silence on the other end was brief, telling. Then came the passive defense. Darling, don't be dramatic. It's a high-profile evening. The press will be everywhere. We're simply being careful with our image. That was it. That one word, image, broke him. Your image, he growled. She's the most radiant woman to ever walk into any room. Your party is lucky to have her, not the other way around. Jasmine could hear every word and stepped closer, trying to urge him to end the call before it escalated. But he wasn't done. If you think for 1 second I'll attend without her, you've forgotten who I am. And if you think I'll let this go, his voice dropped into a dangerous calm. You'll regret this. His mother, always composed, sighed. She doesn't fit, Carter. We've worked too hard to build a brand, and I'm tearing it down if this is what it stands for, he snapped. This is the last time you insult her. Do you hear me? The line went dead, but Carter didn't even flinch. He turned to Jasmine, his eyes still simmering. She opened her mouth to speak, but he closed the distance and cupped her face, his thumbs brushing tears that hadn't yet fallen. You're going to that party, he said with quiet resolve. You're going to walk in beside me, in that golden dress, and every single person there will know exactly who you are, my everything. Jasmine shook her head gently. I don't want to start a war. He leaned his forehead against hers. Baby, the war started the day they tried to shame you for shining. I'm just the fire. That night, Carter made calls, many calls, not to cancel, but to escalate. He doubled the security for the event, hired his own press team to manage coverage, and rewrote the evening's itinerary. He made sure Jasmine's name was not just on the list, but at the top. He arranged a private car for her, a personal stylist, and a makeup artist she loved. Every detail became an act of defiance, every plan a love letter to her worth. And Jasmine, overwhelmed by the depth of his passion, stood before the mirror later that evening as he adjusted the necklace on her collarbone and whispered, They'll try to act surprised when you show up, but they've always known you were the star. She smiled sadly, touching his hand. I don't need their approval. I only need you. And he whispered, Then you'll have all of me. Carter didn't sleep that night. He sat beside her bed, watching her breathe, running fingers through her curls as she dreamed. He was planning something bigger than a party. He was planning a reckoning. Because love, when it's real, doesn't back down. And Carter, possessive, passionate, protective Carter, had just declared emotional war on anyone who dared to hurt the woman who made his soul feel like home. The night before the gala, Carter barely slept, while Jasmine rested peacefully after a long day, filled with mixed emotions and tender moments. He paced the length of their penthouse in silence, his mind an inferno of determination. The cold betrayal from his family boiled under his skin like lava. They hadn't just excluded Jasmine. They had tried to erase her from his narrative, from his life. And for Carter, that was not only unforgivable, it was a personal war cry. No one touched what was his. And Jasmine, with her soft voice, her soulful eyes, and her unwavering grace, was his heart in motion. He paused in the hallway, looking toward their bedroom where she lay asleep under the dim golden glow of the bedside lamp. She had no idea what he was about to do, and that made it more perfect. This wasn't just about correcting a guest list. This was about redefining legacy. By dawn, Carter stood before the tall mahogany doors of his parents' estate, his frame radiating calm intensity. His personal driver had dropped him off without question, sensing something monumental was about to erupt. When the butler opened the door, startled to see Carter unannounced, he stepped aside without a word. Carter entered the grand foyer, his footsteps echoing through the marble. His mother was seated in the breakfast room, perfectly poised with her pearls and morning espresso, flipping through the society column as if she hadn't tried to humiliate the woman her son adored just hours before. His father looked up from the business section, sensing the pressure in the air. Carter, his mother greeted coolly, raising an eyebrow. To what do we owe this visit? He didn't sit. He didn't blink. He looked them both in the eye and spoke with unwavering steel. She will be at the party, he said, his voice slicing through the air, and not as a guest hiding in a corner. She will be on my arm, standing beside me, in front of everyone. The silence that followed was thick, but it wasn't surprise. It was arrogance. His mother chuckled softly, folding her newspaper and placing it down with the grace of a woman who thought she still held power. Darling, don't be foolish. You have an empire to protect. The media, the investors, they watch everything. One wrong headline and everything you've built could tremble. Carter leaned in, placing both hands on the edge of the table. Then let it tremble, he said lowly. Because I'd burn it all before I let anyone make her feel less than the queen she is. His father sighed, setting down his coffee. Son, this is not about race or status. It's about perception. People talk. Carter's jaw tightened. Then let them talk. While they whisper, I'll be living truth. He straightened, buttoning his charcoal coat. You erased her name. But tomorrow night, the world will never forget it. And with that, he turned and left, not waiting for their response. The moment he stepped into his car, he pulled out his phone and called Louis Beaumont, one of Paris's top designers, whose work was never seen without a 6-month wait. But Carter didn't care about protocol. He cared about Jasmine. I need a gown, he said immediately. Hand-stitched, gold-threaded, floor-length, regal. She wears it tomorrow. Louis chuckled on the other end. That's impossible, my friend. Not for me, Carter said. I'll pay 10 times the rush rate. Put every hand in your studio on it. This dress has to stop time. Louis paused, then replied, Send her measurements. I'll make her look like a goddess. Carter hung up and exhaled slowly. It had begun. Back at the penthouse, Jasmine awoke to find Carter at the edge of the bed, watching her. His eyes held a fire, but also something softer, something reverent. She stretched sleepily, reaching for him. "You didn't sleep?" she asked. He shook his head. "I was working on something for you. You'll see tomorrow." She tilted her head. "Carter." He kissed her forehead gently. "No questions, baby. Just trust me." And she did, because no matter what storms surrounded them, Carter's love had always been her shelter. The next day flew in a blur. A team of stylists and assistants arrived at their penthouse with velvet cases, heels, and silken gowns. Jasmine was stunned when she saw the final dress. It was unlike anything she'd ever imagined. Hand-beaded with gold, the fabric flowed like honey, catching light with every movement. The neckline was sculpted to perfection, the back dipped low, and when she stepped into it, she looked like royalty that had returned from centuries past. Carter, already dressed in a tailored black tuxedo, stood frozen when she emerged from the dressing room. "You don't look beautiful," he whispered. "You look like destiny." She smiled, touched her stomach, and whispered, "I feel like I'm about to walk into battle with you." He took her hand, kissed it slowly, and whispered, "Not battle, coronation." When they arrived at the gala, the entire hall paused. Cameras flashed from every direction, and for a moment, time itself seemed to bow to their presence. Carter stepped out first, calm and commanding, but when Jasmine followed, the atmosphere changed. She didn't walk, she glided. Her skin glowed like bronze silk under the chandeliers. Her eyes were lined in soft gold, her curls fell like a waterfall around her shoulders, and her lips carried a quiet grace that silenced every whisper. And yet, it wasn't just her beauty, it was her poise. She carried herself with a dignity that mocked every past insult. She didn't need to prove she belonged. She was the room's reason to breathe. Carter never let go of her hand. As they stepped into the ballroom, heads turned, then paused, then gasps followed. The society elites, who once sneered at her, now blinked in awe. His mother, seated at the head table, watched in stunned silence, her teacup frozen midway. Carter didn't look at her. He walked past them all, eyes only for Jasmine. The music softened. The room dimmed slightly as a spotlight fell on the grand staircase. He led her up slowly, one step at a time, then turned to the room, lifted the mic with steady fingers, and said, "Thank you for joining us this evening." Murmurs rippled. No one knew he was speaking. He took a breath, then added, "I want to take a moment to introduce someone. Not because she needs an introduction, but because the world deserves to know the light I walk beside." He turned to Jasmine. "This is the woman I love. The woman who makes every victory worth something. The woman who never asked to be worshipped, but deserves nothing less." And then, to everyone's astonishment, Carter slowly bent down on one knee. There was no velvet box, only his hands, trembling slightly, and his soul laid bare. Jasmine gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Tears welled in her eyes. "Jasmine," Carter said, voice thick with emotion, "you've stood with me in shadows. Now I want to stand with you in every light. Will you marry me?" The room held its breath. Jasmine looked at him, overwhelmed, then down at the dozens of faces now watching. But none of them mattered. She nodded, eyes glistening, whispering, "Yes." And Carter, in one swift move, stood, pulled her into his arms, and kissed her with a passion that melted every doubt in that room. They kissed not out of defiance, but out of pure, triumphant love. Applause erupted, slow at first, then sweeping across the ballroom. And though some clapped out of politeness, others did so in awe. They had just witnessed something more powerful than wealth. They had witnessed a man choose love over legacy, and a woman wear that love like a crown. The room, once a sea of judgment and curated smiles, now stood frozen in stunned disbelief as Carter slowly lifted his lips from Jasmine's hand and looked at her the way kings once looked at the women who inspired wars and rebuilt empires, his hand still firmly around hers, as if grounding them both in this moment, a moment that now rewrote not just his family's narrative, but the entire social fabric they had tried to protect by exclusion. The kiss they had shared moments ago hadn't just been one of affection or impulse. It was the kiss of reclamation, of truth roaring through gilded lies, a love unashamed and victorious, planted like a flag in the middle of the battlefield they had once been too afraid to walk across. And now Carter stood tall with Jasmine beside him, no longer in the shadows, no longer someone they tried to hide in guest list omissions or polite disapproval. She was not only seen, she was shining. And those chandeliers above, as grand as they were, seemed dull in comparison to the golden goddess standing in their light. Jasmine's golden gown shimmered with every slow breath she took, her chin high, eyes locked on the crowd who couldn't stop staring, some in awe, some in guilt, and many with the frozen expressions of people caught watching history unfold when they'd rather be writing it. Carter's voice rang out again, smooth but laced with power, cutting through the silence like thunder splitting a silent sky. "This is Jasmine," he began, his voice calm but firm, commanding attention not with arrogance, but with undeniable truth. "She is not a name you can erase from a list. She is not someone who disappears because you pretend not to see her. She is my love, my future, and tonight she is my fiancée." The gasps were louder now, some from the older generation clutching their pearls, others from younger guests stunned by the audacity of love choosing honesty over decorum, but all of them were silenced by the certainty in Carter's voice and the devotion in his eyes as he turned back toward Jasmine, his hands slipping around her waist protectively. Jasmine's breath was steady, but her heart raced as if the love she carried inside her could no longer be confined, as if her soul had just been given permission to soar in a space that once wanted to keep her grounded in shame. From the head table, his mother's expression was unreadable, a battle between wounded pride and dawning understanding flickering across her face like shadows dancing across firelight. She gripped her wineglass tighter, her knuckles pale, while Carter's father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a forced smile twitching at his lips, unable to ignore that every camera in the room had just turned away from the chandeliers, the paintings, the overpriced wines, and focused instead on a moment that had more richness than anything money could ever buy. Journalists whispered among themselves, clicking photos rapidly, their instincts telling them they weren't just documenting a party. They were capturing a revolution disguised in gold silk and black tuxedo. Carter didn't stop there. He took Jasmine's hand and guided her down the stairs, slowly, deliberately, like a royal procession that had no intention of rushing for anyone else's comfort. As they walked through the crowd, people instinctively moved aside, not because they were told to, but because something about the air around them had shifted. Jasmine was no longer someone they judged from a distance. She was now someone they had to face, someone who had stepped into their sanctum and transformed it with love, with grace, and with unapologetic presence. Some guests clapped awkwardly, unsure whether it was safe to show approval, while others around them were too stunned to move. A few guests lowered their heads in shame, realizing that their silence had once contributed to this very erasure, that their own complicity had tried to deny a woman like Jasmine her place beside the man she loved. But for every turned face there were eyes that softened, especially the young ones, the new generation that saw Carter not as reckless, but as revolutionary. A little girl in a silver dress tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "She looks like a princess." And that single whisper echoed in Jasmine's heart, louder than any insult she had ever swallowed. Carter heard it too, his lips curving into a rare smile as he looked down at Jasmine and saw tears forming in her eyes. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming joy of being finally seen, fully seen, and not just by the man she loved, but by a world that had tried to dim her light. Carter led her to the center of the ballroom, their hands never parting, and the music resumed. Not the elegant, traditional strings meant to entertain background chatter, but a soft, soulful melody he had secretly arranged just for her, something warm and rich and full of heartbeats. He pulled her into a dance, one hand at her waist, the other at the back of her neck, and together they moved like water, fluid and untamed, completely in tune with one another. Jasmine's fingers rested on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of the heart that beat only for her. And for a few moments, nothing else existed. Not the stairs, not the cameras, not even the past. Just him and her, moving under lights that now honored her presence, instead of ignoring it. Carter leaned in during the dance, whispering against her ear, "You don't have to carry their hate anymore. Let me carry you into a world we'll build ourselves." Jasmine closed her eyes, swallowing back the emotion that bubbled up. "I was never afraid," she whispered back. "But now, I feel free." When the music ended, the applause came, not from obligation, but from something deeper, something more human. It was scattered at first, but then grew louder, more confident, more reverent. A few people even stood, clapping not for the performance, but for the courage, for the truth, for the unfiltered display of love in a world so often masked with performance. Carter turned to face them once again, this time his voice low but firm. "This isn't about approval. I didn't do this to prove her worth. She never needed to be proved. I did this to remind you all that love is not something you gatekeep. Love is not filtered through skin color or family name. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then I suggest you reconsider who you are." His words dropped like stones into still water, rippling through minds and souls, challenging everything that once made them feel powerful in their quiet bigotry. No apology came from his family. His mother sat still, her lips tight, her spine stiff, while his father adjusted his tie and feigned interest in his untouched dessert plate. But Jasmine didn't need their apology anymore. The silence itself was louder than any admission. They knew they had lost, and not in a petty game of pride, but in something much more profound. They had lost the chance to claim love, to witness transformation, to rise above their narrow thinking. And the loss was theirs alone to carry. Jasmine didn't look at them. She didn't need to. Her entire body now carried the elegance of triumph, of someone who had been tested and had come out shining not because of vengeance, but because love had carried her through. She squeezed Carter's hand gently, and he looked at her with a smile that said everything. They had won. Later that evening, as the party wore on, guests came up one by one, some to offer timid congratulations, others to express regret for their silence in the past, and some to simply say nothing, only to bow, slightly in respect. Jasmine accepted it all with grace, not bitterness. She wasn't there to punish. She was there to exist fully, proudly, and beautifully. And Carter, ever the storm in a suit, remained by her side through it all, a protective wall of love that would never let the world diminish her again. When they left the ballroom, hand in hand, their exit was just as stunning as their entrance. The doors opened for them, not because of wealth, but because of something wealth couldn't buy: earned respect. Carter leaned over in the car as they drove away and whispered, "They'll never forget this night." Jasmine smiled, rested her head on his shoulder, and whispered back, "Neither will I." As the black-tinted car cruised away from the grandeur of a ballroom that had once tried to shun her, Jasmine rested her head gently against Carter's shoulder. The warmth of his arm wrapped protectively around her as the quiet hum of the city melted into the background, and all that remained was the stillness between them. the beautiful silence that followed a storm well fought and a battle well won. The city lights sparkled like distant galaxies outside the window, but Carter's eyes never left her reflection in the glass. He watched her in a way that could silence oceans, the kind of gaze that spoke louder than 1,000 promises ever could. Jasmine's fingers slowly entwined with his, and when she tilted her head up to meet his eyes, he leaned down and softly kissed her forehead, not as a gesture of affection alone, but as a vow, quiet and eternal, that she would never again face a moment of erasure, not even in the smallest corners of his world. That night, when they reached his penthouse, the skyline of the city stretched before them like a painting of possibilities, and Carter turned to her, lifting her hand to his lips and whispering, "Let's not wait any more, Jasmine. Let me marry you in a way the world will never forget." And so began the birth of a wedding that would defy the very norms that had once tried to define them. A wedding not built on revenge, but on honor, on passion, on the rare kind of devotion that only grows deeper under fire. Within 24 hours, Carter's team of elite planners, stylists, private pilots, and architects had been summoned into an emergency meeting held in the uppermost suite of a luxury hotel, not to plan a typical ceremony, but to help manifest a vision Carter already saw vividly in his heart. The ceremony, he insisted, would not take place in the city that once questioned Jasmine's worth, nor in any chapel his family once used to impress shareholders. It would be held on a private island where nature itself could witness their vows, where no judgment could interrupt the purity of what they had. He chose the island with the clearest turquoise waters, where white sand stretched like untouched silk, and the ocean sang lullabies only. Lovers could understand. Jasmine was hesitant at first, stunned by the scale, but Carter only smiled, cupping her cheek and saying, "This isn't just a wedding, Jasmine. This is our story written in light, and I want the sun, the stars, and the sea to be our witnesses." The days leading up to the ceremony blurred into a whirlwind of fittings, design sketches, custom fragrance blending, flower selection from 5 different countries, and gourmet menu tastings flown in by helicopter. But amidst the planning there was never chaos, only intimacy. Jasmine was never left to the sidelines. Every color palette was approved only if it made her smile, every fabric chosen only if it matched the softness of her skin. Her wedding gown wasn't just stitched in silence by nameless hands. It was crafted by a designer Carter flew in from Italy, who sat with Jasmine for hours to understand not just her body but her soul. The gown, delicate as morning mist, was hand-embroidered with moonstones and threaded with ivory lace that shimmered like ocean light. Over her heart, stitched so delicately it looked invisible to the eye but permanent to touch, were Carter's initials in gold thread, a symbol not of possession but of belonging. Her veil, long and flowing, was designed to mirror waves so that when she walked, she looked like the sea herself, fluid, majestic, and untouchable. On the morning of the wedding, the island came alive with a silence so sacred it felt like the universe itself was holding its breath. Jasmine stood in front of a mirror surrounded by white orchids and hanging crystals, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched her reflection, unable to believe that the girl once doubted by so many was now standing on the brink of a dream sculpted entirely by love. Meanwhile, on the other side of the villa, Carter dressed in quiet focus, wearing a tuxedo tailored to perfection, his cufflinks engraved with the date they met, and his smile widening every time he imagined her walking down the aisle. When the sun began to dip ever so slightly, casting a honeyed glow across the island, a soft symphony of violins began to play, music designed by a composer Carter had commissioned to score their love story, every note drawn from the emotions they had endured together. The aisle was unlike anything imagined. It wasn't marble or fabric, but an endless trail of fresh white petals laid down by barefoot children who scattered them with laughter. The chairs were arranged in a perfect half-moon overlooking the sea, where golden chandeliers suspended by silk ropes from tall palm trees swayed gently in the breeze. When Jasmine finally stepped into view, time slowed. Her silhouette against the setting sun looked like a painting touched by God himself. Guests rose to their feet, not because tradition dictated it, but because their hearts did. Her skin glowed, her eyes shimmered with the courage of someone who had walked through fire and bloomed. Carter's throat tightened as he watched her draw closer, and when she reached him, he wiped away a tear he didn't care who saw. Jasmine smiled at him, her fingers brushing his chest, and whispered, "I never dreamed this, Carter. But I know now that love can build dreams bigger than what we allow ourselves to imagine." The ceremony was as intimate as it was grand. There were no long sermons or rehearsed speeches, just two people standing under a canopy of stars and chandeliers, promising one another more than forever. Carter's vows were simple, yet earth-shaking. "You made my world beautiful, Jasmine. Before you, everything was controlled, calculated, and cold. You taught me to feel. You taught me to live. And I promise, for every breath I have, I will use it to remind you how loved you are." Jasmine's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "You found me when the world refused to see me. You fought for me when I was too tired to fight for myself. You made me feel like I belonged, not because I changed, but because you loved every part of me as I was." The officiant nodded gently, holding back his own emotion, and with a warm smile declared them husband and wife. The moment Carter leaned in and kissed Jasmine, the crowd didn't just clap. They erupted in joy, some standing, some crying, some simply holding hands in awe of the purity that had just unfolded before them. Fireworks exploded behind them, silent at first like falling stars, then in vibrant color as if the sky itself had blessed their union. Jasmine held on to Carter, her lips still tingling from the kiss, her eyes never leaving his as the wind swept around them, lifting her veil into the air like a banner of triumph. The reception was no less magical. Beneath a glass-ceiling tent erected beside the waves, guests dined under candlelight, feasting on dishes that blended Caribbean spice and French elegance, every flavor curated to tell a part of their story, from the mango desserts that reminded Carter of the first kiss on Jasmine's balcony, to the wine chosen from the vineyard they once wandered hand in hand. But it wasn't the luxury that made the night unforgettable. It was the way Carter couldn't stop touching Jasmine's hand, the way she leaned into his chest during their first dance, and the way the stars above seemed to blink just a little brighter, as if smiling down on them. And what struck everyone most was Jasmine. Not her dress, not the wealth, not the setting, but her. The way she laughed freely now, no longer weighing each gesture for fear of being judged. The way her eyes sparkled like she'd found not just love, but sanctuary. Even Carter's mother, who had once stared through her like glass, couldn't ignore the radiance that pulsed from Jasmine like a hymn of survival. She didn't say anything that night, no apology, no acceptance. But her eyes lingered a second longer, her silence now heavy with realization. And Carter, aware of it, simply held Jasmine closer during the last slow dance and whispered, "Let the world stare, love. You're mine now, and I'll spend every day proving I'm yours." When the celebration came to a close, Jasmine and Carter disappeared into a private villa surrounded by orchids and candles. But their departure wasn't quiet. Guests continued to talk long into the night, whispering not just about the luxury of the event, but about the power of what they had witnessed. "They made me believe again," one guest murmured. "They showed us what love really looks like," another added. And that was Carter's real gift, not just a wedding that stunned the world, but a love that reminded it what truly matters. And Jasmine curled in his arms that night as waves kissed the shores outside their window, knew in her heart that the vows exchanged under stars weren't the start of their forever. They were simply the continuation of what had already begun the moment he saw her, and never looked away. The moon lingered like a shy witness in the sky as Carter carried Jasmine into their private glass penthouse, an architectural masterpiece suspended above a sleeping city, where the skyline bowed in admiration to their love, and the stars themselves seemed to pulse a little closer, as if desperate not to miss a single heartbeat of what was about to unfold. Jasmine, still in the remnants of her bridal gown, had her cheek pressed against Carter's shoulder, her heart still trembling from the ceremony, the music, the applause. But now the world fell away like petals in slow motion, and all that remained was them. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, the air inside changed. It was no longer just a luxury suite designed with gold accents and floor-to-ceiling windows. It transformed into a sacred realm built solely for love, where time slowed, sound softened, and even gravity bent under the weight of intimacy. Carter didn't speak at first. He simply looked at her, as though the moment demanded silence, his thumb brushing her lips with reverence, as if afraid to blink and miss her entirely. The lighting was soft, warm, like melted amber glowing across the marble floors, casting her brown skin in shades of bronze and moonlight, making her look like a celestial being whose presence humbled even the glass and steel around her. Jasmine reached for his collar, gently undoing the buttons of his tuxedo with fingers that trembled, not from fear, but from a depth of emotion so intense it made her breath catch. Carter took her hand and kissed each fingertip slowly, deliberately, then lifted her palm to rest against his chest, letting her feel the thunder of his heartbeat, a rhythm that had belonged to her long before vows were ever spoken. With quiet hands, he led her into the master suite, a space designed not for opulence alone, but for memory-making, with cascading white curtains that danced in the breeze, and thousands of roses suspended from the ceiling like they were frozen mid-fall, caught by love itself. Soft jazz spilled from hidden speakers, its melody curling through the air like a lover's whisper, while vanilla and sandalwood candles flickered along the walls, lighting up the room with a fire far gentler than the one burning between them. Jasmine slipped off her heels and stood barefoot on the plush ivory rug, her toes curling slightly as Carter walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her gently into him. His lips brushed against her shoulder where the gown had fallen slightly, and he murmured, "You don't know what you do to me." Jasmine turned in his arms, her fingers tracing his jawline, then his lips, her eyes searching his face like she was reading scripture etched in flesh. "Show me," she whispered, and that was all the permission Carter needed. He lifted her again, cradling her as if she were made of stardust, laying her gently on the bed where silk sheets waited like a promise beneath her. The gown loosened easily beneath his touch, falling away without resistance, revealing the masterpiece she was, every curve, every line, every breath of her painted in reverence and strength. But he didn't rush. No, Carter took his time, kissing her forehead first, then the corner of her eye where a tear shimmered, then her neck where her pulse throbbed, and finally her collarbone, where his name would live forever in the memory of this night. "Jasmine," he breathed, like a man finding God in a whisper. "You're not just my wife, you're my miracle." His hands traced along her skin with the devotion of an artist, painting love in every gesture, and when their mouths met again, it was no longer just a kiss. It was a covenant, an unveiling of emotion that had built like an ocean behind a dam, and now poured out without apology. Their bodies moved in perfect rhythm, guided not by lust, but by a symphony of emotion, each movement another verse in a poem only they could understand. Jasmine gasped, her fingers clawing gently into his back as he kissed down her spine, igniting sparks with every breath he took against her skin. She wasn't just seen, she was worshipped. And Carter didn't just touch her with desire, he touched her with awe, like she was something he never thought he deserved but would die to protect. Their moans were not loud, but deep, filled with the ache of longing and the joy of finally being whole. They explored each other as though it were their first time again, not in naivety, but in rebirth, learning new rhythms, new sighs, new ways to whisper love without words. Jasmine laughed in the middle of it, her head thrown back, eyes filled with tears, overwhelmed not by the act, but by the truth. This man loved her, unapologetically, eternally. Later, Carter pulled the sheet around her as he held her in his arms, his chest rising and falling in time with hers, both their bodies glowing from the intensity of shared love. He kissed her hair, her temple, the corner of her lips, and whispered secrets that only nighttime could carry. "Do you know what tonight meant to me?" he asked quietly, brushing his fingers down her arm like tracing verses of poetry. "I've built empires, Jasmine. I've made headlines, closed deals worth more than most people will ever see. But nothing has ever felt like this. Like you. You are my beginning and end." Jasmine pressed her hand to his chest and whispered back, "Tonight, you made me forget every insult I ever heard. Every time I felt unseen, unwanted, you erased it with your love." They drifted between sleep and kisses, wrapped in silken sheets and memories being created with every heartbeat. At one point, Jasmine sat up slightly and looked out the glass wall, watching the city lights flicker below them like a sea of fireflies, and she smiled to herself, not because she had married a billionaire, but because she had married a man who saw every bruise on her soul and still kissed it with reverence. She curled back into Carter's arms, the warmth of his body cradling her like a lullaby, and she slept with peace sewn into every breath. By morning, the sunlight crept in softly, stroking their skin through the glass as Carter lay awake, watching her sleep like she was a painting that breathed, his fingers brushing strands of hair from her face. He didn't move, didn't want to. The world outside could wait. His meetings could wait. The universe itself could pause because right here in this glass cocoon of love and light, he had everything he had ever needed. Jasmine slowly blinked awake, stretching like a cat in the soft cocoon of sheets, and when her eyes met his, she smiled, sleepy, radiant, and completely his. He kissed her before she could speak and murmured against her lips, "Good morning, Mrs. Carter." She giggled, her hands running through his hair. "Good morning, my forever." And they didn't get out of bed. Not right away. Not when love had woven itself so tightly around them that even the ticking of the clock dared not interrupt. They spent hours just being, talking, touching, laughing, sharing dreams and memories, allowing themselves to be lovers and best friends all at once. The breakfast Carter had ordered sat untouched on the side table, because no meal could compare to the taste of her lips, the warmth of her skin, the sanctuary of her embrace. And as the sun climbed higher and the world outside began to spin again, Carter and Jasmine lay there in their glass castle above it all, untouched by noise or judgment, living in a moment too perfect to name. He didn't just hold her, he anchored her. And she didn't just love him, she honored him with every glance, every whisper, every kiss that promised more. They had waited their whole lives for this night, this union, this peace. And now that it was here, Carter made himself a silent vow. I will never let go. Never stop choosing her. Never stop making her feel like the only woman in every room. And Jasmine, wrapped in his arms, already knew. This wasn't just a night. It was a forever beginning. The morning after their wedding night, with sunlight slipping across the silk sheets like golden ribbons, Jasmine stirred in Carter's arms, smiling against his chest before lifting her head to kiss his jaw. Gentle, slow, her fingers curling around his. He tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, still in awe that she was his, that the universe had conspired to bring this woman, this light, this fierce, soft miracle, into his life. But nothing, not even the perfection of their wedding or the intimacy they shared that night, prepared him for the moment Jasmine stood barefoot on the edge of their bed, weeks later, her hands trembling as she held out a small white stick, tears welling in her eyes and lips quivering in disbelief. "Carter, I'm pregnant," she whispered, and the words hit him like a soft explosion. His knees buckled, and without thinking, he dropped to the floor, his arms wrapped tightly around her legs as his head gently pressed to her stomach, laughter breaking through his stunned silence like music too beautiful to be contained. He didn't cry because he was afraid. He cried because joy this big, this divine, needed an outlet, and the only thing greater than the pride on his face was the wonder shining in his eyes. That night, Carter knelt again, this time under the soft, dim glow of their fairy-lit bedroom, and kissed her still flat belly with reverence, whispering, "I don't care who you are yet, but I already love you more than life." From that moment on, Carter wasn't just a husband. He transformed into something softer, something even more astonishing. He began every morning by spooning Jasmine and pressing his lips to her belly, whispering sweet nothings to the life growing inside her, as if his voice alone could build a sanctuary around them. Jasmine's glow intensified, not just because of pregnancy, but because she was loved in a way that made even her shadows shine. Carter refused to let her lift a single thing, laundry baskets, groceries, or even a book on the top shelf. And she'd laugh when he sprinted from the other side of the house just to bring her water or fluff, her pillow. The penthouse that once echoed with sleek elegance now rang with lullabies hummed into her belly. Carter's baritone voice laced with lullabies he'd written just for their twins. Every corner of their home became a labor of love. The nursery was a world of dreams painted in pastels and clouds. With furniture Carter assembled himself, refusing help despite his wealth, because my children will sleep in something built by their father's hands. And Jasmine, who had always been graceful, carried her growing belly like a crown, walking barefoot through their home with Carter trailing behind her like a devoted shadow, ensuring her path was safe, her cravings were met, and her every sigh met with soft kisses and unwavering support. Carter became a man reborn in those months. He read every parenting book, signed up for online baby classes, and even joined Jasmine in prenatal yoga, where he awkwardly but enthusiastically posed beside her, earning gentle teasing from the instructor and adoration from everyone watching the billionaire CEO become utterly human in his devotion. He attended every single doctor's appointment without fail, often arriving early and holding Jasmine's hand the entire time, watching the ultrasound screen like it held the meaning of life. The first time they heard the twin heartbeats, tiny but strong, fast but steady. Carter gripped Jasmine's hand so tight she could feel the tremble in his fingertips. "That's them," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "That's our future." Afterward, he went home and recorded the sound, playing it softly every night before they went to sleep, saying it was better than any symphony he'd ever heard. Jasmine craved strange things: mangoes with chili, toast dipped in chocolate milk, ice cubes with lemon juice, and Carter became an expert in fulfilling them at every hour, even if it meant driving through midnight traffic or flying in fresh mangoes from another country. Her comfort was his command, her needs his only priority. He massaged her swollen feet every evening, read poetry to the babies in her belly, and when back pain crept in during the third trimester, he bought a reclining chair just so she could rest in absolute comfort, wrapping her in his arms while they watched old movies and talked about names, dreams, and futures. One night, Jasmine felt insecure, her belly big, ankles swollen, hair undone, and she murmured through tears, "I don't feel beautiful anymore." Carter turned to her, gently lifting her chin, his eyes blazing with sincerity as he replied, "You're carrying my children. You are creation itself. You've never been more beautiful to me than right now." He then took out a velvet box and revealed a necklace he'd designed himself. A delicate gold chain with two small heart-shaped pendants, each engraved with the initials of their future children, and in the center a ruby, representing Jasmine. "You're the heart of this family," he whispered, placing it gently around her neck, and Jasmine cried not from sadness but from the overwhelming weight of being loved so thoroughly. Each passing week, their love grew deeper, layered with shared dreams and midnight confessions. They danced slowly in the living room, her belly between them, their foreheads touching, the fairy lights blinking. A softly above, casting the kind of magic you can't buy or recreate, only live. And Carter would sing to her belly, make up lullabies on the spot, calling their babies little stars, saying they would shine with her strength and his love. The final trimester arrived like a gentle tide, swelling with anticipation and tenderness. Jasmine moved slower now, but Carter never rushed her. He'd walk beside her through the garden, hand on her back, whispering how proud he was, how in awe he remained. She'd wake at 3 a.m. with aches and restless thoughts, and Carter would be up in seconds, rubbing her back, bringing warm milk, kissing her shoulder, and reminding her how strong she was. "I can't wait to meet them," he'd whisper, his voice cracking, as if he couldn't believe he was this close to fatherhood. Jasmine would smile, place his hand over her belly where the twins kicked, and say, "They already know you." Baby showers came and went, filled with laughter and pink and blue decorations, but nothing compared to the intimacy of the quiet nights they spent, planning, hoping, dreaming. Carter began to write letters to the babies, notes for them to read when they turned 5, 10, 16, full of fatherly advice, silly jokes, and confessions of his awe for Jasmine, telling them how she saved him long before they arrived. Jasmine painted watercolor animals for the nursery walls, while Carter installed a star projector on the ceiling so the babies would sleep under constellations, even on cloudy nights. Time flowed like a song, each note a moment too precious to forget. Jasmine's belly grew full, round, radiant like the moon itself, and Carter couldn't help but stare in gratitude every time she walked into a room. He began planning paternity leave, canceling meetings without hesitation, telling his board, "This family is my empire now." He even hired a private midwife and prenatal doula, making sure Jasmine had the gentlest, most supported path possible. And when Jasmine struggled to sleep, he'd lay beside her with one arm around her belly and the other stroking her hair, softly telling her bedtime stories until her eyes closed peacefully. As the due date neared, Carter packed and repacked the hospital bag a dozen times, rehearsing the drive, placing Lucky Charms in the car, and checking her phone every 5 minutes just in case. He even had a playlist of her favorite songs ready, each one chosen to calm her, to honor her, to celebrate her. 9 months passed, not in haste, but in poetry, wrapped in laughter, cravings, quiet dances, and kisses pressed to a belly that held not just babies, but the proof that love, when fought for, becomes legacy. And on the final night of the 9th month, Jasmine stood on their penthouse balcony, her hands resting on her round stomach, eyes full of stars, heart full of tomorrow. Carter came behind her, kissed her neck, and held her from behind, both of them looking out over the city that once seemed too cruel. But now, with their children just hours away, the world didn't seem cruel at all. It felt conquerable, bendable to their love. Carter whispered, "You gave me the greatest gift. Not just the babies, but this love, this family, this peace." Jasmine smiled, leaned back into him, and whispered, "You gave me the safest place I've ever known." and together they stood in silence, waiting, knowing that the next chapter was coming soon. But for now, in the final glowing breath of those 9 magical months, all that existed was love. The quiet before dawn held a strange, sacred stillness, the kind of calm that felt like the universe holding its breath just before something extraordinary unfolded. And in the soft blue shadows of that early Sunday morning, Jasmine felt the first sharp ripple of pain shoot through her, catching her breath as she gripped the edge of the headboard, her other hand instinctively moving to her belly, now round and full with the life they had nurtured so carefully for 9 long months. The stars were still out, fading gently into the lightening sky, when Carter, ever attuned to every change in her breath, stirred beside her, his eyes opening with instant alertness as he saw the expression on her face. He didn't panic. Instead, he moved with a quiet urgency, sliding out of bed and kneeling beside her, one hand on her cheek, the other already reaching for the hospital bag he had packed and repacked so many times that he knew it better than his own office briefcase. Jasmine nodded, her breath coming in measured, practiced puffs, and he kissed her forehead before helping her up with tender strength, guiding her into the soft slippers he had placed by the bed every night for weeks, just in case. The drive to the private birthing center was filled with quiet music and Carter's voice, steady, soothing, reminding her to breathe, reminding her she was powerful, that he was there, that she wasn't alone, not now, not ever. When they arrived, the midwife met them at the door, and everything seemed to move like a well-choreographed symphony. Jasmine in a gown, monitors gently placed, soft lighting filling the room like morning sunlight trapped in golden jars. Carter beside her the entire time, never letting go of her hand, whispering promises and gratitude into her ear between every contraction. Hours passed, but Carter never left her side, not even for water, not even to rest his eyes. His world was in that room, in the woman whose strength unfolded before him like a force of nature. And when the moment finally came, when Jasmine cried out in effort and life filled the air, Carter's breath caught as the first of their sons entered the world, a powerful, beautiful cry shattering the stillness and announcing his presence like a sunrise breaking the edge of the ocean. Moments later, his brother followed, smaller, gentler, but no less fierce in his arrival, and for the first time in his life, Carter wept in a way that was not polished or quiet, but raw and humbled, his hands trembling as he held each baby, one after the other, against his chest, skin to skin, his tears soaking their soft caps as he whispered over and over, "You've made me a father, my love. You've made me whole." Jasmine, exhausted but glowing in the light of their son's cries, watched him with a peace she had never known, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, to anchor him in the moment as nurses bustled around, and the midwife placed both boys in her arms, wrapped snugly in soft white blankets embroidered with gold stars that Carter had commissioned months ago. In that room, there was no memory of the judgment they had endured, no echo of rejection, only the warmth of 2 new heartbeats, the sacred silence of beginnings, and the quiet triumph of love. When Carter stepped out for a moment to call his assistant and inform him to cancel all meetings indefinitely, word of the births reached his family sooner than he expected, and by mid-morning, curious footsteps echoed down the hospital corridor. His mother came first, hesitantly, carrying a small bouquet that seemed out of place in her perfectly manicured hands. She stood in the doorway, unsure, eyes flickering from Jasmine to the tiny bundles in her arms, her practiced composure faltering as one of the babies stirred and let out a sleepy sigh. Her gaze softened, perhaps for the first time, and Carter watched her from across the room with a heart both guarded and expectant. Jasmine didn't say a word. She simply shifted slightly, allowing his mother a clearer view, her face calm, proud, and gracious. It was that grace, not words, that cracked the armor. His mother stepped forward slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she peered down at her grandsons. Their skin was soft and brown, their curls fine and dark, their lips full and perfect, and there was no denying their beauty, nor the love that radiated from Jasmine's tired but glowing face. "They're beautiful," she whispered, voice hoarse, and something in her eyes gave way, as if the weight of years of quiet prejudice had begun to melt in the face of undeniable truth. Carter watched, barely breathing, as his mother turned her gaze to Jasmine and said, "I was wrong." And though Jasmine said nothing, her slight nod was answer enough. It was not forgiveness given easily, but dignity held firmly. His father entered next, stiff and uncertain, but paused at the threshold as he took in the sight. Carter cradling one son, Jasmine holding the other, the room glowing with life and light, and something holy. He extended a hand, not toward the babies, but toward Jasmine, and for the first time in years his handshake held no conditions, no expectations, only the weight of acknowledgement. Jasmine met it, with a quiet grace, never letting go of her son, her eyes calm but unflinching. The others came too, cousins, siblings, family friends who had once whispered behind manicured smiles, and each one softened in the presence of innocence, each one disarmed by the quiet miracle these babies represented. The twins became more than children. They became a bridge, a living testament that love, when fought for, can build something even blood cannot destroy. Carter held Jasmine's hand through it all, his fingers laced with hers as they navigated the delicate reunions. But he never let down his guard, not entirely. He was gracious but never apologetic for the boundaries they had built. And when one aunt suggested politely that the babies might be easier to raise with the family's help, Jasmine smiled and replied softly, "They'll be raised in love, and that's all they'll ever need." It wasn't bitterness, it was truth spoken with grace, and the room, once so filled with judgment, now held a reverent silence. Later that night, after the visitors had gone and the babies lay in their bassinets, swaddled in soft moonlight, Carter pulled a chair beside Jasmine's bed and just watched her, watched the rise and fall of her chest as she slept, her fingers still curled around a baby's mitten, her lips curved in a peaceful smile. He whispered more to himself than to her, "You did this. You changed the world, mine, theirs, even theirs," nodding faintly toward the door where his family had stood hours earlier, broken open in ways they hadn't expected. The babies cooed in their sleep, and Carter stood slowly, leaning over to kiss both tiny foreheads before pressing one last kiss to Jasmine's temple. He didn't need to say anything more. Their love had already spoken the loudest truth. Jasmine had risen with dignity every time they pushed her down. She had loved with elegance, walked through fire with bare feet, and now cradled the proof of everything they had fought for. Carter didn't just love her, he revered her. And now, holding their sons under the same stars that once bore witness to his lonely nights, Carter knew the war was over. Love had won. And Jasmine, she wasn't just the woman he married, she was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. The first morning home from the hospital brought a light softer than sunlight, a warmth only new life and healed hearts could cast, and Carter stood quietly by the window of their villa's master bedroom, holding one of their sons close to his chest while watching Jasmine sleep, her face relaxed, peaceful, her hand gently resting on the second twin curled beside her. He leaned in and kissed the baby's temple, then crossed the room in slow reverence, placing a kiss on Jasmine's forehead, the words, "Thank you for our everything," whispered against her skin like a vow he would never stop making. Life no longer revolved around corporate meetings, billion-dollar deals, or boardroom strategies. It rotated around 3 a.m. feedings, baby giggles, and the kind of love that demanded nothing but gave everything. Their home, a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa surrounded by flower-laced balconies and garden courtyards, had once been designed as a luxurious retreat from the world. But now it had become the sacred space where love echoed through every hallway, where laughter filled the ceilings like music stitched into the walls, and where every moment felt like a page in a fairy tale rewritten by truth and passion. Carter, once the cold strategist of high-rise boardrooms, had transformed into a man who measured his success not by wealth, but by the joy in his wife's eyes and the rhythm of his son's laughter as they toddled down the hall, chasing butterflies and childhood dreams in a backyard that stretched like a canvas of possibility. Every morning began with Carter in the kitchen, wearing a soft gray robe, flipping golden pancakes shaped like stars and elephants, humming old jazz tunes as Jasmine joined him barefoot, her hair cascading down her back, her eyes bright even in sleep's shadow. She would sing softly as she held one of the boys on her hip, the other tugging at her gown with tiny, determined fingers, and the three of them dancing together as Carter plated breakfast and declared with a grin, "This right here, this is the empire I'm proud of." The garden became her sanctuary, a place where Jasmine walked barefoot among the rose bushes, singing lullabies passed down from her grandmother, now made new as her boys gurgled in delight beneath sun hats, their brown skin kissed by sunlight and freedom. The vines clung to the trellises like old dreams finally finding roots, and birds flew low, as if even nature bowed to the joy that bloomed in the home they had built, forged from love and war, pain and redemption. And as the weeks passed, Carter's family began visiting, not with the stiff awkwardness of regretful apologies, but with the humility of people who had seen love conquer their ignorance, who now showed up not out of obligation but admiration. His mother came often, baking cookies with Jasmine in the same kitchen where once Jasmine had been judged in silence, now transformed into a place of shared laughter, whispered recipes, and soft reconciliations. She brought photo albums, stories, gifts, and a newfound gentleness that came not from guilt, but awakening. Carter watched all of it from the doorway sometimes, one son on his hip, the other pulling his hair playfully, his eyes wet with the realization that Jasmine hadn't just changed his world, she'd rewritten it for everyone who stepped into her grace. The villa was no longer a fortress. It was a family's heartbeat. Jasmine and Carter held hands everywhere they went, walking the beach at sunset with the twins strapped to their chests, curled up on the couch with lullabies, playing low or even sitting on the porch swing while rain tapped gently on the roof. Their fingers intertwined, eyes locked in a quiet language. Only they spoke. Carter never let a day pass without whispering in her ear, "You're my everything." And Jasmine, with a soft smile and glowing eyes, would respond with a kiss and a promise only her soul could give. And the world noticed. Magazine covers once filled with scandal and speculation now told a different story. The billionaire who left the spotlight to raise a family in love, the woman whose strength turned legacy into legend, the couple who turned prejudice into poetry. Interviews came, but Carter only agreed to one, a televised piece where he stood beside Jasmine, holding her hand, and said to the world, "I was taught how to lead companies. She taught me how to live." And when Jasmine was asked how she survived everything with grace, she simply looked into the camera and said, "Love. The kind that doesn't flinch when it's hard, the kind that doesn't ask permission to exist." Their sons grew in that truth, surrounded by not only toys and books, but by history, by pride, by bedtime stories about queens and kings who looked like them, about mothers who rose without shouting, about fathers who defended without apology. Carter taught them chess in the evenings, Jasmine read them poetry in the mornings, and together they built memories on swings, in kitchens, on beaches, in bathtubs filled with bubbles and laughter. On their 5th anniversary, Carter flew Jasmine back to the island where they had wed, not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet homecoming to the place their forever had truly begun. He recreated the floral aisle, lit candles along the sand, dressed their sons in tiny tuxedos, and under the same stars where they once exchanged vows, he knelt again, not to ask for her hand, but to thank her for her heart. Jasmine, wearing a new golden gown stitched with the initials of their children, wept silently as Carter whispered, "Every day with you is proof that love isn't just possible, it's unstoppable." They kissed again beneath a sky that had once held their dreams, now holding their reality. Their legacy became a tale told in classrooms, churches, and hearts, a story of how a black woman erased by judgment became the soul of a dynasty, and how a billionaire once defined by power became a man reborn by love. Years later, as their sons grew and asked about their wedding, Jasmine would smile and say, "It was magic, but real," while Carter would add, "It was war, but we won with love." And when the boys asked what changed everyone's hearts, Jasmine never mentioned the money, the fame, or the speeches. She simply said, "Truth," lived out loud. And the truth was this: Jasmine, the woman they once called not enough, had become the sun around which their universe revolved. She had danced through fire with grace, kissed hatred with forgiveness, and turned pain into a garden. Carter had loved her not because the world approved, but because his soul recognized its match. And together they wrote not just a love story, but a revolution wrapped in romance, a masterpiece of hearts rebuilt from ruin, a family not born from convenience, but carved from conviction. In the quiet moments before bedtime, Carter would carry both sons up the grand staircase, whispering blessings in their ears, then crawl into bed beside Jasmine, pulling her into his arms like he did the night of their wedding. And just before they drifted off, he'd always say the same thing, words now as familiar as the stars. "You, my love, rewrote everything, and I will love you until time forgets our names." And Jasmine, with sleepy eyes and a heart that had once been bruised but never broken, would kiss his chest and whisper, "Forever wouldn't be enough.